called Development, Economic Rights, and Gender-Based Violence Priorities for Post-2015. FYI. So I just want to make sure everyone's in the right place, in the right space. And this is what we're talking about. I would love just to hear from the audience, anybody. If anybody wants to say, what do they see? What do they want to get from this panel? If anybody volunteers, some hands. What do you hope to get out of this panel? Go ahead.
I'd like to learn more about the post-2015 agenda.
Okay. Anybody else about this panel about development, economic rights, and gender-based violence? Go ahead. Yep.
Yes, we know that we haven't been able to meet a lot of the MDG targets. And now I want to find out how we are reprioritizing to meet some of these targets after the MDG targets are passed, after 2015. What are the new priorities, the ones that we have not been able to meet? What is going to make a difference?
Did you hear that, Alice? Okay. What's going to make a difference? Because we didn't hit all the MDG targets. What can make a difference for post-2015?
I don't know whether I learned something about gender-based violence in terms of economics.
Okay. Okay, good. All right, connection between gender-based violence and economic rights. Go ahead. Two more.
Just want to know how the economic development can eradicate or can eliminate the gender-based violence.
I'm sorry, gender-based violence? Okay. So, okay.
This one over there.
Right. Okay, last one.
Thank you. I want to hear about how, what are the spaces for eliminating the gaps between what civil society organizations are often saying for addressing the systemic issues of inequality and poverty, and what governments are saying and not addressing those at all.
Just like that.
So we have 4 days.
I hope this panel will be able to address all of those questions. But again, everybody around here, everybody in this audience is an expert. So please, we're going to address a few issues here. But again, your colleagues too can also support you to think through this too. So I'm really excited again to start this panel off. And we really do have a fantastic panel with wonderful leaders here from 3 different organizations. So I wanted to do a little quick bio for our 3 illustrious panelists. I might get my notes.
Everyone illustrious.
Illustrious, yes. Illustrious panelists. So the first one, Anita Naya, she's right, screen right. She's the chief of the UN Non-Governmental Liaison Service.
Mike?
Oops, sorry. She is the chief of the UN Non-Governmental Liaison Service. She started last year, April 2013. The UN-NGLS Non-Governmental Liaison Service is an interagency program that promotes the development of constructive relationships between the UN and civil society. So Anita will answer your question there. And before that, Anita has been working extensively in the women's human rights field. She was at one point on the executive committee member of DAWN, Development Alternatives with the Women for a New Era. And she actually, has an extensive background in women's rights internationally. Our second panelist is Madeleine Rees. She's the Secretary General of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. And I'm sure many of you know this organization, but it is a membership organization that seeks to achieve peace through disarmament and the inclusion of women's rights. Madeleine also, she's a lawyer. She started out as a lawyer. She's still a lawyer, and she too has had an extensive career in human rights. And she worked in the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights as a gender expert and head of office in Bosnia-Herzegovina. Radhika Balakrishnan is Executive Director for the Center for Women's Global Leadership, and CWGL, besides having 16 days of activism that I'm sure many of you know, CWGL develops and facilitates women's leadership for women's rights and social justice worldwide. Radhika is also a professor in women and gender studies at Rutgers University. She's worked with the Ford Foundation, and she too has worked extensively in the women's rights field. So we have an incredible cohort here that is in the fields of women's rights and now is actually really leaders of these fantastic, remarkable institutions that really focus on women's rights or within the UN, really trying to create some constructive pathways for engagement. So I am going to like all these papers. It's very difficult here. Okay. No tables. So again, this is a panel on on militarism, gender-based violence, macroeconomic policy, and they're all connected. And we want to know from these panelists really about, how does it affect post-2015? What are the implications from your perch? All three of you are leaders of international global organizations, working in local areas, regional areas, internationally, and just to really understand sort of how, from your perch, what are you doing to influence the post-2015 agenda in terms of these issues of militarism, macroeconomic policy, civil society. When we think of Ukraine, we think of Syria, we think of Sudan. All of these are really, to me, really visible ideas and thoughts that kind of connect to all three of these issues. But I'd love to hear from you all, how are these issues, how are they going to be influencing the post-2015 agenda? Anita.
Thank you, Rini, and thank you for that framework for introducing the session. Thanks for the opening set of questions. I think that was really helpful. And thank you to CWGL for hosting this event and for inviting me. So for the past 10 months, I've been sitting inside the UN. That's my first experience to be sitting within the system, and it's been quite an eye-opener to see the ways in which this institution really relies in so many ways on civil society for content, for collaboration, for politics, and yet it's the structures that should support it are very weak, and the structures that should really enhance these voices and their influence in the process are also quite weak. So I think it's a big comparative advantage that the UN has over, as a multilateral body, over an institution like the World Bank or the IMF or the OECD that don't have the support of civil society and of the public at large. And the UN does have this, and it's an advantage that they have, a comparative advantage if you want that they have. But civil society needs to repoliticize the space. And from where I'm sitting, I see the need to repoliticize this space and to challenge it, while at the same time supporting it. It's a tricky balance, but I think it needs the support in order to survive as a relevant body, but it also needs to be challenged. And that's the interesting space that I have in the office that I'm in, that I can channel both those sets of voices. And so one of the things we did last year, the Secretary General's office asked us to convene a consultation with civil society all around the world in 3 months on the post-2015 agenda, and deliver some coherent outcome. And I really paused to look at how was the UN listening to civil society. And what I found was, while they had a series of 100 or so national consultations that some of you may have been involved with. Were any of you involved in the national consultations leading up to 2015 in your countries? Just one, that's fascinating. So, and then there were 11 thematic consultations that were held on major issues like inequalities, water, energy, and so on. Were any of you all involved in the thematic? Just one. So, it shows you how, at least from the women's movements, that the engagement was rather limited. And I can say from 2 country consultations that I was in, it was really a handful of women's groups that were actually informing the UN and governments what was going on. So I'm not making a blanket assumption of any of these consultations. Some of them were run well, but on the whole, there was not enough critical analysis that came through those processes. However, they set an important stage, an important effort for the UN to actually reach out. Now, this brings the consultation that we were asked to do. So the other set of ways in which the UN has been listening is online. So they've launched a whole set of online consultations. And so we looked at who is it that's really been contributing to these online spaces, and we found that 2/3 of the inputs, substantive inputs, I don't mean voting for what you may agree as your priorities. I mean substantive analytical inputs into the online consultations. We found that 2/3 of them were from the North or from North-based institutions that have counterparts in the South. And so we thought, okay, what's wrong with this picture? How do we then listen to a whole other set of voices and make those visible? So we ran a series of regional consultations with regional networks. So in order, the criteria was you had to be a network that operated beyond a national context. You had to be based within the region, in other words, not north-based. And if you were in the North American or European region, you could be based in that region, of course, but operating within the region. So like this was a particular criteria. We had 3 months to do it. This is the slice we took. Over 150 networks participated in this short 3-month period that collectively collaborate with over 3,000 national and community-based groups. And what was fascinating to us was that, and we conducted this in 4 languages, by the way, in Arabic, French, Spanish, and English. And we also noticed that much, if not 99% of the discussions have been held in English leading up to 2015. So even the resource materials that we could find in Spanish and French and Arabic were so minimal. Even to get the computer system to run the text from right to left was also incredibly challenging. I mean, these kinds of structural obstacles are very real to movements in the regions of levels of engagement. So at any rate, we ran this in 4 languages. And what was fascinating to us was that in every region across the north and south, that more than a third to a half of the conversation was about the economic and structural and systemic obstacles to development. I mean, this was across north and south. And participants pointed to trade and investment rules, the international financial institutions. They talked about the connections between illicit capital flows and conflict. I mean, these kinds of interconnections as what are actually the structural obstacles to development and what is actually driving poverty and inequality came through very clearly. And how such obstacles are actually affecting people's access to basic services, whether it's education, energy, food, water. I mean, you know, all these are severely hampered, as including the country's policy space to actually deliver on those services. So I think this is one strong current of advocacy and analysis that has come through, which is not entirely out of sync with where governments are at, in our opinion. Now, yes, the powerful countries may not be in sync with this, but there are a number of countries that are realizing the effects of the kinds of constraints around their development and the kinds of pathways they have taken, whether it's the kinds of public-private partnerships they have taken or the kinds of bilateral investment treaties that they have signed over the past few years, past decades and so on. They are seeing the negative impacts of this within their countries. And they are speaking about this. These are states that are speaking about this on the floor. And I think we need to find allies with these kinds of states and help to, build a political partnership, if you want, between civil society and states that are vocalizing these similar constraints. The second set of so the first demand, if you want, that came through in these consultations was called rebalancing power for justice. The second call that rang through very loudly was the entire human rights framework. So yes, all human rights for all, but also specifically looking at those who are historically excluded and need to overcome that exclusion. So this may have been the closest to where, for those of you who know the high-level panel report, or these kinds of UN reports that have come out talking about leave no one behind, I think was the framework they used. So to some extent, although they did not embrace a human rights framework, they were looking at communities that were excluded and the need to ensure that they're not. Now, how to ensure that they're not is a whole other matter, but the fact is there is some visibility of groups that have been historically excluded. So the third strong call that came through from all regions was the linkages between human rights and care for the planet. And here, everyone in each region articulated the kind of destructive practices, especially around extractives, that really go hand in hand with human rights violations. So whether it's land and resource grabs or extractive industries, and a lot of this was framed within the escalating crisis of climate and greenhouse gas emissions. So how these are interlinked and not separate from human rights, and how we need to find not only redistributing resources equitably, but also using them safely. So very strong concerns around unsafe practices, whether it's nuclear technologies or geoengineering or these kinds of new technologies that are seeming to be fixes for the crisis we're in, but in fact are very dangerous practices. So this came through strongly. And the last call that came through was really looking for solutions for how to address those first three I mentioned: rebalancing power, the human rights for all, and the equitable redistribution of resources and safe use. And that was to look at how do we hold accountable the violators of human rights and halting the destructive practices through accountability mechanisms that are transparent and fundamentally respect people's right to participate, whether in decisions that happen close to their homes or those that happen thousands of miles away. And here, there was, interestingly, in every region, very strong concern around public-private partnerships. And how these initiatives are actually allowing corporations to have an undue influence. And here, public-private, the P was seen as corporate, and how this has allowed an undue influence of corporations over the agenda setting as well as the decision making by governments. So it's a question of whether these kinds of public-private partnerships can institutionally weaken states and potentially institutionally weaken the United Nations and the multilateral process. So this came through very strongly, as well as proposals for how to ensure things like the human rights principles on business human rights principles on business, as well as Principle 10 of participation. There were various kinds of proposals of how to ensure participation and the right to participate. So these are the ways in which we've engaged by making visible voices from the regions and regional networks that sound to some extent different from these kinds of consolidated voices that we were hearing earlier. Through the open working group process now, there's been 8 open working group sessions on a whole range of issues that largely appear to be siloed, and we're now entering into 5 negotiation sessions. Well, they're not calling it negotiations, but sessions where there will be further discussions, not narrowed by issue, but more interlinked. These are important opportunities for us to engage, and one of the things NGLS was asked to do by the open working group chairs was to look at that regional consultation report and to provide policy briefs based on the issues that they were looking at. So we've produced 8 policy briefs. I've brought 3 in the room today that are relevant to our conversation here, but there's others as well. One is on women's human rights and gender equality, the second on macroeconomic policies, and the third on what's called means of implementation, which deals with a lot of the systemic issues as well. So I hope these recommendations are useful tools for you in the advocacy process, and I'm really happy to think through how we can sort of make visible the issues that are structural and that are systemic and really are at the root of all the issues on the table, and how do we bring a very clear feminist analysis to that and feminist voice to that. So I'm really delighted to see all of you here, and I hope that some of you can continue to engage in the open working group process.
No, thank you, Anita, so much. We're going to have follow-up questions, but I just wanted to get really everybody's comments. And so, Madeleine, I wanted to get from you, from your perch, from your organization's perspective. Again, thinking about the post-2015 agenda, thinking about militarism, thinking about gender-based violence, how do you see it all connected? Where do you see the energy, and where do you see some solutions and some challenges too?
Well, I think very interesting coming out of what you just said, is a reminder that in fact many of the issues that are being faced in the post-Millennium Development Goals period are going to be exactly the same ones as we have been facing historically. We're looking at strengthening the multilateral system and not losing faith in it. We're looking at social and cultural and economic rights as human rights, which can actually be effectively addressed through a system of accountabilities, including, obviously, a social contract with your government. We're looking at challenging root causes of conflict, and within that, obviously, we have to look at issues of militarization. And within militarization, we then have to look at equality and how that impacts on the circular argument going back to social and economic rights. In fact, the organisation I work for is going to be 100 years old next year, and that's exactly what they said in 1915. All that's happened is the context in which we're working has changed, and some of the nuances have changed, and who we have to address is different, but the principles articulated by those people that you managed to get input from are exactly those. Where we're coming from, we want to engage in all of those, and there are entry points. You've got multiple entry points. You can see you can come in from a direction of gender-based violence, you come from macroeconomic policy, but if you look at it through the lens of militarization for the moment, and then say that's just one entry point. Militarization is dependent on a series of social, cultural, and economic fits. They're all interlinked together, which is why we have to address all of them. Without that particular approach, the social, the cultural, and economic actually working together, you will not get militarization. I said at a meeting last year that I was really worried about fairies, the little ones with wings. And I was worried about them because in America, they have become militarized. There is a thing called Wings Club. And my daughter watches it, and she sees these little things, which I thought would be very nice in the film, where they go around and hang out butterflies and flowers like fairies do. But no, they are fighting the bad boys. This is like your worst nightmare of 1325. And the reason why that is important is because it shows that we are now in a cultural environment where the use of violence is seen as legitimate in ending any sort of conflict, armed or otherwise, but use of violence is now something that is seen as being the norm, and it's highly gendered. Because essentially, although we have the kick-ass fairies, we know that militarization is highly gendered in terms of it is masculinized, and women who serve in the military know the results of that. The sexualized violence that occurs in the military is now legion. So there's that element, but there's also the element of what it does within society itself. It depends on the use of a violent norm. So in order to be able to address it, we have to deconstruct the concept of violent masculinities and really get to grips with what and how that impacts on gender relations and how gender relations are causal of some of those very problems that lead to militarization. So you have, before a conflict, for example, you will have gender relations will deteriorate as there is the approach of conflict, as men become more masculinized, more into the use of violence as a potential means for change. Women become the antithesis of that. They are re-victimized, whether it be in the Bosnia conflict, the Syria conflict, and you have then the stereotypes of gender really coming to the fore, and violence flowing from that. And then that continues after a conflict. And so what we end up with is we look at both individual violence and militarized, therefore, state violence as being part and parcel of the same thing, which is gender relations. Which is why we're talking about the post-development goals era. We need to actually put gender first and foremost as transformative of whatever does come out of those various conversations. If we then apply that to this whole range of social and economic rights, what we're really looking at is how can we actually increase the participation of women in economic space and economic activity, and how we can change the discourse on social and cultural rights to create that space, because they are inherently interlinked. The militarization, again, inhibits that growth by draining and drawing resources out of the system, obviously. We're doing a lot of work on Syria right now, and if I tell you that there is at least $3 billion worth of arms that's come from Qatar to fund the opposition to Assad. Probably about $5 billion come from Saudi Arabia for the same purpose. Not to mention then how much the Russians are spending on arming the other regimes. And you have a realization that there is a complete discrepancy in what the needs of the population are compared to the arms that are being given to continue the militarized conflict. $3.6 billion is needed to stop 12 million Syrians falling below the poverty line. That's been the humanitarian report. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And yet the sorts of monies put into the militarization part of the conflict are totally unequal. So rethinking that is a fundamental part of what we need to be doing in terms of addressing not just the ending of conflicts, but also social economic rights and sustainable development. There's been reports about the Millennium Development Goals essentially not having, because it was sticking plaster basically, and if you look at what they actually were trying to address, they were looking at plugging holes, not really addressing root causes, and as a result they have not done very much at all. And there is a need in this next big agenda, which is the one that's being discussed now. The next big agenda, we need to make sure that we prioritize the very things that are being said to Anita, as you're there. We need to put them, we have to position them front and central. So I think we need to have a transformative gender analysis. We need to have social economic rights as social policy, which is directed by human rights and regulated through the human rights system and monitored by the multilateral system. Now, if we had all of that, we're beginning to get to where we need to be to have sustainable, I'm going to say pro-poor growth, because that's not true either. Because essentially, welfare systems that have been shown to work are based on social policies which actually address middle class and everybody equally. It's not based on just need. So there is a genuine solidarity, which if we do it from a gender perspective, to try to make sure that we elevate the status of the population on the basis of equality, so women are not thought of as being unhelpful, unuseful if they do not engage in economic activity. We create possibilities for that. So all of that would be transformative. But I think there's another part which is very, very scary, and that is when we were talking about the environmental issues. Of all the parts of the state's geography that are most engaged in environmental issues, it's the military. You go to any climate change conferences, the military have always booked up the hotels first. And that's because it's a security issue for states. It's not about preventing environmental degradation, it's a security issue. And the military are already designing or making the case for increased resources for them to tackle the immigration flows they think that are going to happen as a result, and the instability that will then happen. They're already making preparations for what will happen when states most affected by climate change become unstable and then become safe havens for inevitable the terrorists that they can then go and deal with. So they've got their own plan. They're well ahead of us. And I think what we need to make sure that we do is, when looking at how we position ourselves in relation to this new big agenda, it is to make sure that we are addressing climate change and environmental degradation in a way which deals with root causes, which go back to those things that are being identified by those people participating, so as not to hand the concept of security back to the military and then perpetuate this cycle of militarization.
Thank you so much. So Radhika, you're with Center for Women's Global Leadership, and you have a lot of expertise, obviously, on macroeconomic policies. And I'm just curious, again, I want to get a little bit from you, just reactions from the two speakers here, and also include your perspective around macroeconomic policy and how does that need to be integrated into the post-2015 agenda?
Thank you. I mean, when both Madeleine and Anita were speaking, I kept shaking my head saying yes, yes, yes. And I have to say, it's really exciting to be on a panel where everyone is talking about the structural issues. And that doesn't happen often. And I think it's important for us to keep coming back to the root causes. And either the root causes in terms of inequality, the root causes in terms of militarism. I think we need to do it more often. And from, especially at the building over there, we need to go and talk a lot more about the root causes. What I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about is, you know, one of the things that everyone is talking about, and actually I was at a panel this afternoon and John Hendra was speaking and he said, you know, if we don't have human rights at the center of this new development agenda, then we're just the same old thing again. And the Millennium Declaration, which started the MDGs, was very, very great on human rights, right? The language was that this is going to be a human rights invested development agenda, and then they wrote this great declaration and all the states said yay, 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 and then they came up with these stupid goals that had no connection to the declaration or the human rights agenda, and they were just targets and indicators, and we all know that, you know, we got education and MDG3 and maternal mortality, and any of the kind of structural issues were absent. And we were supposed to somehow meet these goals in the absence of a critical assessment of the economic policies that created poverty in the first place, right? So somehow you can eradicate poverty without actually changing economic policy. And so we met some of those goals because China did well. But don't tell me that in the 15 years we've actually been successful in dealing with the structural issues that create poverty. So as we're going towards this post-2015 agenda, in the next 2 weeks we're assessing the MDG goals, I think we need to think about what does it mean to have human rights at the center of this agenda. And I've been hearing people speaking about this, and this kind of, it takes me back to kind of a statement that one of my teachers had written about, which is in doing feminist economics analysis, often what people did was they added women and stirred, you know, so that you had your same old thing and you put in a little women and stirred and you thought that was a feminist analysis. I'm finding the same thing happening with human rights. I think people are saying, yes, we need a human rights approach. Yes, we believe in a human rights approach. And then it's the same old thing. And there's not a change and there's not a challenge as to what that means. So I think one of the things that we really have to focus on is not talk about human rights as just this, as the declaration did at the Millennium Declaration, and then you go on with development as it always was, but to see the kind of the radical potential of a human rights framework. What is the radical potential of a human rights framework? There's quite a few, and I just want to highlight a few of them. And one of them deals with what both Anita and Madeleine talked about, which is how governments prioritize their spending. Right? So why is it that the military gets all its spending? You know, why is it that certain issues don't get any spending? Well, there's human rights norms that say that governments are supposed to progressively realize economic and social and cultural rights. So that's there. It's in the. It's not invented. We didn't make it up. It's in there. So what does that mean if you're supposed to progressively realize economic and social rights? It actually gives you a mandate as to how to deal with your budget issues, right? Where are you going to spend your budgets? How are you going to decide between different issues? There is language. You're also supposed to not retrogress. Once you're moving towards a right, you're not supposed to cut back. Well, how come austerity has become the mantra for the entire world? And anytime anyone talks about economic problems, people just say, well, you know what, debt is going to ruin us. But when did that become the convention? Right? That sometimes it's okay to borrow money in order to stimulate the economy. It's kind of very old school Keynesian economics. economics, sometimes you borrow money to try and put money into the economy so it generates it. It's not rocket science, but that idea has just been declared, non-existent. I was in Puerto Rico a couple of weeks ago giving a talk at a university there, and I don't know if any of you are following, but Puerto Rico's their government bonds were just declared junk status, right? So their government bonds are declared junk. And I was with a lot of people there talking about what are they going to do about Puerto Rico, and again, it was the assumption that the government actually trying to spend its way out of this crisis was the government being negligent rather than the problem with the credit rating agencies that decided that they were junk bonds, that we need to look at that. I mean, France, for example, I think 2 months ago was graded down by the credit rating. Do you all know the credit rating agencies, right? These are these private, non-regulated industries that decide what kind of status your government bond has. So France, I think 2 months ago or 3, I forget, time flies when you're having fun, recently declared France to, grade B, it was grade A and grade B, I don't remember the exact, but downgrading them. And the reason they gave that for France to be downgraded was because France taxes people too high and spends too much money. And so that is kind of a political assumption the credit rating agency just took, that taxing people and spending government spending, that's a particular thing that governments do. But because they didn't like it, they downgraded them, and then what happens to France? All their bonds, their interest rate goes up, and it makes them broke, right? So I think we need to talk about, when we talk about human rights, it can't just be about waiting for the violation to happen and say, oh my God, look, all these people are going hungry and the right to food is being violated. But what are the policies we need to ensure so that these violations never happen, right? How do we, the credit rating agencies, it's really something that I get really cranky about. Anyone who talks to me about credit rating agencies, I'm going crazy. There's no regulation of them. They answer to the private sector. So when we talk about this public-private partnership, this private entity is controlling public debt with no one overseeing it. So going back to how do we use human rights has something called the obligation to protect. And that obligation means that there needs to be a regulatory framework that doesn't make Puerto Rico go into junk bond because the credit agency did it, right? And so I think, and often the obligation to protect is used to go invade countries rather than create regulatory frameworks so that the private sector is regulated. And the last thing I wanted to say was that a lot of human rights is targeted at nation states, and it's to hold the nation state accountable. But we also have to look at extraterritorial obligations, because we can't just, I was going to explain, I know, it's a weird looking word. Extraterritorial, I can barely say it, it's like I had to practice quite a few times to get the R's right. Extraterritorial obligations are, what are your obligations when something you do affects people in other countries? And I'll give you a very clear example. The financial crisis that happened started in the United States, right? The reason why the financial crisis that started in the United States was because of a regulatory change of the banking industry, right? So it was, and literally it was 4 men who wanted to make Citibank Citicorp. They walked in and they got rid of all the kind of barriers for the banking industry to get into very savvy financial investments. That act of changing the laws in the US created and continues to create havoc around the world. So how do we hold people, because we're in a globalized world, we don't have, especially economics, I mean the trade treaties, I mean all of these treaties, they're global. And so we also need to look at human rights outside of just nation states, and not only about human rights in business, because that's voluntary, There's no, I'm sorry, businesses are not going to volunteer unless they can have a campaign that raises money. It's like, it's a marketing strategy to kind of have, what is it, the GAPS Red campaign or something. But we need to have a regulatory framework, because if we're living in a globalized world, then we need to have a global human rights architecture. We have trade agreements, we have intergovernmental trade agreements, we have the WTO, blah, blah, blah. But what about an international human rights framework that actually looks at the international ways in which our economy functions right now?
Thanks. One thing that I keep hearing, a little bit of a theme, I'm trying to think a little bit more positive, is, Anita talked about rebalance for justice, rethink, transformative gender analysis, Radhika, radical. I was just thinking from your organizational perspective, thinking about some solutions to rebalance for justice or transformative gender. How can, we're here at the UN, Post-2015 is happening, some maybe radical ideas. Like, what do you think? How can we insert transformative gender justice? How can we think about rebalancing for justice? As Anita's the working group was talking about, what are some solutions and some examples of that from where you're sitting of work that's being done?
It's a very short answer compared to the complexity of the question. I think the major problem that we have with the multilateral system is that it's fragmented, as is the law that is then used to regulate the different parts of it. So when people talk about trade agreements, they think of bilateral contractual laws which regulate that trade. And they sit in the World Trade Center, they sit in Geneva, and just down the road from the Human Rights Council, but never the twain shall meet. So when you're talking human rights, you go to one building. You're talking disarmament, you go to another building. When you're talking about international humanitarian law, you will then go and talk with the UNHCR or with the ICRC, but they will not cross-fertilize. And that's where it starts to go wrong, because essentially it's state policy and practice which governs that system. And it might well be that in some of the smaller countries that they will have two people that will actually work all of those bodies. But won't necessarily think to apply what they're saying in the Human Rights Council to the trade policies that they will be developing. Now this was something that we at WILPF we've been working on, how you can actually move towards a sense of convergence under international law, which we are absolutely sure, because we have now done work, is legally correct. That of course different legal disciplines must cross-fertilize and work with each other in order to have coherence, otherwise there would be chaos, because basically no regulatory frameworks. So if we're going to do that, then how do we actually make the system work for us? And how do you make it so that we actually get that transformative gender analysis in from the very beginning? Think of the system as it's supposed to be. Which is essentially, if you're looking at human rights and treaty body reporting and working with the Human Rights Council, and you want to get this convergence, this integration together, then we need to have really good, correct information coming from grassroots. We really need to know what is happening in that country in order for there to be an appropriate response from within that multilateral system, which means that information that you get has to be on the issues that are really critical to the people who are living there, so that response is structurally based. So essentially, good gender analysis of information going into human rights bodies, good advocacy around that, then getting good results back. But I'm saying human rights bodies because what we want is to make sure that if you are reporting to one of the treaty bodies, or if you are reporting to the Universal Periodic Review of your countries, you say how much money is being spent on the military. You say what arms are being exported to other countries. You say what the roles of the multinational extractive industries are doing, and demand, through your shadow reporting and your legal analysis, what you want the other states to be saying about that. Now that has started, and we have had some fairly good results so far. The CEDAW committee, with their general recommendation 30, has gone a long way in pushing that agenda in relation to militarization, international humanitarian law, and other areas that we are concerned with. But we have to start making this system respond much more coherently than it has up till now. There is also the much maligned and misunderstood responsibility to protect, which was supposedly to help and assist us in doing this. Unfortunately, states have chosen to use the last bit of it, which is basically bomb the crap out of somebody, instead of doing the first bit, which is to help and assist countries where the human rights are failing. And that really has a huge impact in terms of social and economic rights, because as we've seen, there is an obligation on states to help other states when there are violations or when there's a failure to give access to social and economic rights because of a lack of revenue. So given if we have all of that, then we can actually start looking at the states who have that extraterritorial responsibilities and to get them to be the ones that are part of the solution. Now there are basic principles involved in this, and that is there's lines of obligation, and it's if you have a geographic proximity, if you have an economic weight, if you have a military connection, or a political one that you can use to influence the government, there is a legal obligation on you to use that for the betterment of human rights in the country that is under review or is in some way in need of support. That exists, but nobody really mentions it. And this is partly, again, our problem, because we have a multilateral system, and yet we haven't been so intelligent about the way we have used it, because member states don't want us to use it that way. And partly, and this is just not being cynical, it is, I think, and I've asked states this, it's more lack of attention span. There's so much going on that it's almost impossible for states to actually fulfill all the things they should be doing because they've taken their eye off the ball. I mean, you can see now, everything's Ukraine, nothing Syria. And they don't have enough staff to do it, and I actually had a conversation with a different example, the UK, because there was an extractive industry in DRC that had links to the UK, and I actually asked them what they were going to do about it. And they said they had a very superficial look at this particular company, to the extent that they found out that it was a subcontractor of a subcontractor of a subcontractor. It would take them, they reckon, 200 investigative lawyers to work out the connections, and they simply did not have the resources. And therein lies our problem. That even if we have the situation where people want to do the right thing, sometimes they don't have the abilities to do it, which goes back to the structural problems. And I think the points you're making about having private companies regulate how states conduct their internal domestic political choices is part and parcel of that whole structural problem that we've got to address.
There's two intergovernmental tracks going on. The Open Working Group for Post-2015, the Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals, and what's called an Intergovernmental Committee of Experts on Sustainable Development Financing. And why I mention this is because in the Experts Committee, they're talking a lot about so-called new and innovative sources of financing. I mean, where is the money going to come from to actually finance this new development agenda, whatever it looks like? So it's beyond purely a question of finance. It's also about capacity building issues. It's also about trade issues and intellectual property rights. And it's a much more expansive set of policies that are required to actually implement. But finance is a key part of it. And right now, a lot of the discussions have been weighted toward corporate financing and new and innovative sources of blended financing where you get aid to leverage private sector finance and so on and so forth. And just last week at the Experts Committee session, there was someone there from the private sector who was talking about the credit agencies and the role they play. And they were challenged by an expert from the South saying, in fact, the credit agencies are part of the problem in limiting what we can and can't do with our public spending. So I think this is what I mean about certain states are living a reality. I'm not letting states off the hook for their human rights violations and so on. But there is a growing reality that something is very wrong, and there's an opening, I think, for civil society to enter into these arenas with creative alternatives, whether it's using the rights framework or whether it's more community-driven sources of financing, or ways in which we can create institutions to monitor and regulate the corporations, or to reform the international financial institutions, or look at economic governance in a different way at the global level. I mean, there's so many aspects to this rebalancing power for justice that have been articulated and that we need to keep raising in these kinds of forums. And I would, for those of you who are interested in this track, I think the expert committee on financing is a key space to do this. And there is, interestingly, a sympathetic ear, not across the board, but strong enough that I think we can gain some traction there. I would just encourage those of you who are here, at least, to pick up some of these recommendations, because there are a set of recommendations around reforming the international financial architecture, reforming international tax architecture. There's a lot of work done on tax justice at all levels, from corporations to domestic, to problems with the climate finance architecture, obviously the trade and investment architecture, safeguards for PPPs, which, as Radhika rightly said, is not just about voluntary, but very much about binding, what's the option, voluntary? Binding. Yes, binding. Thanks. Yeah, compulsory, and which have been proven and used in different countries and contexts, and so we have a track record of that. The next phase of work that NGLS is planning to engage in is more specific policy initiatives that are being taken to advance these kinds of broader recommendations. And so we're looking at within each region, because it appears that, at least from a cursory reading really, it appears that some of the initiatives that are being taken at the regional level are actually much more bold than what's being discussed at the global. Now that doesn't mean that the answer lies in the regional, because it's clear that either the national and regional initiatives, these are being undermined by some of the global policies. So there needs to be a very clear linkage and analysis about what's required at all levels, from national through to global, to actually create the conditions necessary to realize any of the goals that may emerge. But we are looking at some key policy initiatives, some that are in the region. For example, in Latin America, the progressive tax policies that they have implemented for the last decade, but also what they see as necessary reforms to international tax reforms that are necessary. New and emerging regional architecture, regional economic architectures that are being created, whether they're regional banks or different ways in which the regions are being more integrated. And what are the pitfalls of that? It's not that necessarily that just because we have a regional bank it's better than the World Bank, but what kinds of safeguards and policies do we need to ensure are in place to make sure that kind of resource base is actually supporting the kinds of development policy we want to see. Another key strand for Latin America that has been identified is the safeguards for public-private partnerships, because they're facing massive investments in infrastructure development for the region and linking the region, and this has largely been quite destructive. So how do they look at safeguards there? For the other regions, they're similar but slightly different sets of issues. In Africa, it's very much linked to illicit capital flows and conflict and militarization, the linkages there, as well as to extractives. So we're looking to actually model some examples of policy initiatives that are, in partnership with civil society, in political partnership with civil society, that can actually showcase to the global what is possible. That doesn't mean that we'll let the global off the hook, but it's situated within that wider analysis. but at least to demonstrate where initiatives can be taken and where they are being taken, and to make that visible. Because there appears to be this sort of false notion that it's, that at the end of the day, it's a certain set of governments that have the resources to give to another set of governments. Even though there's a talk of the whole agenda being universal, there's an artificial divide here, and I think we need to sort of rebalance that space as well, and show that there are progressive policies coming from elsewhere.
My question's about thinking more about policy, risk, transformation, transforming this post-2015 agenda. What do you see as sort of maybe some potential?
Yeah, I think,
Potential for convergence.
yeah, I just got totally absorbed in their comments and then I forgot what I was supposed to do. I mean, I think that Madeleine, you talked about the divide between the different people in Geneva. There's another divide is between Geneva and New York.
Yeah.
And I think that's a divide that we really need to pay attention to because, something has, it's like they're two different worlds. Whenever I go from one to the other, there needs to be a conversation, especially the human rights discourses that take place in Geneva, even though they're siloed, don't really come here that often, and they don't stick, And so so I think that's another divide that needs to be worked on. And I'm very happy to hear these kind of ideas of regional answers. I'm sorry, but I want to be also a little bit negative. I know I'm not supposed to be, but this is an attempt to challenge neoliberal economic policy that has been in place for a long time, that has really screwed the world. And so the challenge is uphill. There is no easy answer. And the private sector is hunkering down because they don't want to lose anything that they've gained, and they want more of what they've already gained. We have the worst level of inequality. I mean, look at the world we're living in. Where 10 people make more money than half the world. That's a wrong number, but you know what I mean. They're just. I mean, I think they said something like if they increase the taxes on 10 billionaires in New York by 0.03%, it would fund schools for all the kids. What I mean? So it's that level of inequality that we're living in, and in some ways we have to call it out. I mean, yes, there is the kind of north-south divide, and the UN actually it's very much a part of the different development agendas, and they're real. I'm not saying they're not real, but what our real struggle is to challenge this economic paradigm that is not working. I mean, and I think what both of you said, it's not working. Everybody knows it's not working, but there's vested interest in keeping it the way it is because some people, they're doing really well from the system. And so how do we then talk about this not only in terms of negotiated language in a text, which is why we're all here and we're going to do whatever it is, but we also have to really challenge the paradigm that is really not working for the North or the South. I mean, so it's not like suddenly everyone in the United States has universal health care. Well, we haven't had that in a long ever. But you talked about the welfare state. I mean, I remember going to a meeting where people, I forget, from Latin America said, wow, when Europe is now saying the welfare state is no longer going to be a paradigm, that's bad because that was at least thought of as that's going to be there. Even that's being challenged, right? I mean, you're talking about the European economies in complete austerity. And what does austerity mean? That social programs are being cut. And so how do we challenge that mentality to say that we need a different kind of role of the state? I mean, what is, and I mean, I'm convinced that using a human rights framework, because states have agreed to it, can challenge that. I don't think it's the only answer, I just think it's one of many. But what we have to do is to really call it what it is, which is a really messed up system that a few people are really gaining from, or a few people in some countries are gaining from, and that the kind of excitement in some ways of this post-2015 agenda is being able to call it that and try and really do something. Do I think we're going to be able to do it with some document? I don't. But can we bring in new and fresh ideas, that stuff that Anita was talking about, that can at least enter into that conversation? This is one of the few places we can do it. So I think we have to continue doing it. I don't know if it's going to be transformative and suddenly post-20, in 2 years we're going to have gender justice. I don't think so, but I don't think we have any option but to keep trying. So it's not, I'm being a little negative, but I think we have to do it. But the fight we're fighting is a really big one. It isn't a small one.
Thank you. I want to actually give some time for the audience here to weigh in with some questions. So, or comments too, definitely, absolutely comments. I'll start.
Is that mic?
Yeah, okay. Do you mind?
So if you could come up right at the mic.
My name is Anita Naya. I'm from the Women Speakers Program. Maybe a hard one, but I think also we need to look at ourselves as civil society. The last couple of years, I'm really getting a bit shocked that the neoliberal capitalist values are very much becoming part of civil society. For example, competition versus cooperation, branding versus crediting your partners, which is an activist way of working, and also delivering what is wanted instead of questioning it and posing the difficult, hard questions. So I think in terms of the transformative framework, what I have seen, why is that not enough out there? Because sometimes we participate in making sure that it slowly disappears. I think if you look at the Beijing platform, you really can see in there that when women talked about peace and security, there was a very transformative element in it. Then 3025 came about. Over the years, 3025 has been a really great thing for countries to sign on to, and we have participated in creating national action plans, but much of that has been about more women in the military. Now, I think there should be diversity of opinion, but I felt more and more that the transformative aspect of demilitarization, disarmament, military budgets, there is less space for that, and sometimes in circles, women's groups will even call you upon it when you raise it. I don't bring that issue in, or, and that it also has to do with our dependence, our economic dependence on budgets. So I think there's something at play here where government sometimes uses service providers, also in terms of lobby and advocacy, and I'm also getting more worried what it's going to mean now the private sector is coming in. Do they really want your criticism? And I think we need to stick together, because otherwise, people are just going to work with the ones who provide easy answers, and the one with the difficult ones are just going to be pushed out.
Thank you.
Agreed. Does anybody want to come up? Yeah. If anyone wants to come up, they can come up and.
I can sit here.
Everybody can't hear you. That was a really, really excellent intervention, because that is so true. We have, and this goes back to this whole way in which cultures are created, and then we find ourselves behaving exactly that same way. And then this self-selection is already happening. And you can see that by the way in which it's elbows out, let's get the money and move on sort of thing. And that I really would ask everybody here to do exactly what you said. Really pay attention to how we work collaboratively as activists, not just as passive recipients, well not passive recipients, recipients of donor money, so that we then become service providers, because we see that happening all the time, and then we will no longer be able to hold them accountable.
I think you're going to just speak up.
Can I stay here? Can I stay here? Yeah.
I don't know.
I would say I will. Well, if you wanted to go there, I will.
No, I'll go after you. Yeah, I'll go after you.
How about we get these
You give it to
two
me.
questions?
Yeah.
You just do these two right? Sure.
Yeah.
My name is Khadija Afawi. I'm from Tunisia. Tunisia, where the Arab Spring started. One of the remarks I noted was about civil society sending information, but I think the UN has base everywhere. So we have the United Nations in Tunis and also embassies. So I'm sure all the information they have. But still, civil society has been trying to send information. You said also something about arms, and I wanted to tell you something. I attended, I think it was in 2012 in Doha, a UNCTAD meeting, and I was surprised by the presentation made by a very bright Tunisian young girl who presented Tunisia as a heaven, which was more or less the case before the revolution. We used to be a very peaceful country, there never had been any violence. But she said nothing about the violence that had started and about the way the country had become divided between Muslims, Islamists, and non-religious people, which is not true. We are all Muslim with a minority of Christians and Jews. And so I wanted to say a word. They gave me the microphone, and when I started speaking about how our country began after, in 1956, with independence from France, with President Habib Bourguiba, who thought about giving women, who said that there could be no development without the participation of women. So he did lots of things, and we had a code of personal status that made of Tunisia one where women have the most rights in the Arab world. And now, I want to say something about the violence that is in the country. We have arms coming from Libya, from the frontiers, not only arms, but also drugs, and also the huge amount of money, national monies, and also hard currencies. They are coming from the Gulf, from Saudi Arabia. My question is, I'm thinking about the event I attended in Doha, Qatar. How does then the UN react to those flows of arms and monies that are sent to create this chaos in our part of the world? Yeah.
So it's a very short answer.
Sorry, yes. And I don't know whether this will be taken into consideration in the next CSW meeting. Thank you.
We're going to just take a couple, if you could, we have a pretty long queue.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. I just want to answer the young woman who spoke before this old one. Yeah. Sorry, I'm older than you, so that's okay. I'm from Sydney, Australia, and we've set up a civil society coalition, and our government allows us to use a video conference room every 3 months. When some of the people from other civil society organisations were saying we maybe need money from the government to run a secretariat, I said, did you sleep in your own bed last night? Did you have breakfast? Then you don't need any money. That's for the homeless women. So we do it and we volunteer the time. And we discuss the National Action Plan, and it is possible.
From right there.
Hi, I'm Carol Barton. I'm with United Methodist Women and also the Women in Global Migration Working Group. I just first wanted to really thank my sisters for focusing on structural issues. As Radhika said, it's far too absent in the discourse, and I think a lot of the discussion from women's organizations and from all of civil society about the SDGs has been, add my issue to the SDGs, add my identity group to the SDGs, add this, and very much what you said, add and mix into a completely broken failed development model. So I really appreciate the focus on that, as well as our strategizing on where to go. I do agree that we need to use the mechanisms of the human rights system. We need to weigh in on the actual, whatever this process is going to birth, but we also need to maybe have parallel processes that expose and peel away the lie about, why is it that we aren't meeting the Millennium Development Goals. I know in this country, in the US, when they dismantled the social welfare system, suddenly they wanted to talk about micro-enterprise and women pulling themselves up by their bootstraps and put the burden on poorest women in order to deal with something as the whole structure was being dismantled of social protection. And the MDGs represent the same thing. It's looking at individual nations and saying, why aren't you pulling yourselves up by your bootstraps? And why haven't you delivered when there's this giant sucking machine that's sucking out resources massively through capital flight and trade deals and corporate profits and all of that, and we're not looking at that. So to make it short, I'm kind of playing around with, I'd love to see if there's interest among other groups in being part of the regular process, but also developing another, suspect development goals, or I don't know, strategic development goals that list, where are the small arms being sold? Let's measure which countries are selling those small arms. Let's measure the CO2 emissions that are creating climate, destabilizing countries. Let's develop a set of SDGs that shifts the focus from why aren't poor countries and communities pulling themselves up by their bootstraps, and sheds light on where the resources really are going. And I know that that's somewhat of more of a publicity and media exercise, but I think it would help in doing what some of the original efforts were trying to point out. Thank you.
Hi, I wanted to kind of piggyback on Carol's statement and also to say thank you to everybody for a really important and substantial conversation that doesn't always happen. So it's very appreciated. I wanted to comment on what you said, Radhika, about the fact that economic change isn't going to come from a negotiated document because of those vested interests. And I think that, we all recognize that social change requires a political mobilization. But I think also that we've kind of been lulled over the years into moving away from a language and an approach of political struggle, because we're so happy that governments are engaging with us through the human rights mechanism. And yet we all know that those mechanisms, those human rights instruments don't have any enforcement mechanisms. So that in fact, that's part of the reason why governments are willing to sign on, because they know that nobody can really make them do it, and it will make us be quieter. And that, by any other name, it's co-optation. And I think it's always, that balancing act that we need to do, and that ability to be strategic and yes, engage, but also not lose that other piece of how do you do that? How do you sit at the table with them and maintain that approach of political struggle? And I think that one of the things that all of you are saying in different ways is about making sure that everybody, not just us, but all people operating in social movements beyond the ones that are represented here these 2 weeks, understand that human rights is an incredibly valuable tool for people who are engaged in political struggle. And it's another one of the sort of silos that we have, right? So people talk about human rights in this building and another one in Geneva, but it would be great if economic justice movements were accusing human rights, if the climate justice movement folks were using it. And I wanted to know, either from here or from here, if people could comment a little bit on what you see as either strategies for that, places where it's not happening, places where it is happening in particular. That would be great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Radhika Balakrishnan. I work for I2C, which is the International Trade Union Confederation. Besides, it's a union movement which represents also about 70 million women workers, so there you know a bit more about my background. I wanted also to refer to the first speaker. I think it's very important that we connect and that we try to work together. Imagine if we all, millions of women, stand up and really put a lot of pressure together at the very same time. I am convinced that we can achieve that agenda. Just want to give you one small example. In the past 2 years, we have done a lot of global campaign for domestic workers' rights based on an ILO convention which was adopted at the ILO conference 2.5 years ago. These women suffer. They suffer violence. They are abused, exploited, and face horrible situations. And many thought for years that it's impossible to improve their rights, but it was possible. In 2 years' time, our estimate is that 10 million domestic workers today are better off. They've seen their wages doubled or tripled, and they have regulation of working time. They have access to social protection. In one country, more rights than another. But why was this possible? We connected. We connected with international organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, and so on. So all this. So it became a movement. And by showing that we were a movement, we were able to shift the positions of governments and of employers and of others. And this is a force I think we need to believe in. And I'm also stepping forward because, and I think, on Friday we are organizing an event at 4:30 in the Salvation Army, the auditorium. And also the Center for Women in Global Leadership is hosting it. But there we, as a union movement, as women in the union movement, we like to connect with you, how we can further work together to better shape that agenda, to bring about change. And by connecting and by uniting, I think we can move forward. I really hope you use it. So you're very welcome on Friday afterwards.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Anita Naya. I'm at Syracuse University in upstate, in Syracuse University in upstate New York. I just wanted, you had asked about examples of civil society working together and having regional effect. I just wanted to throw out the example of the newly reformed UN Committee on Food Security. They reformed in 2008, and they have only voting members are nation states, but the consultative body has 4 civil society members, 1 member from the private sector, 1 member from the financial institutes, and so on, but more from the civil society than others. And the civil society representatives are chosen through a civil society mechanism that highlights gender balance and regional diversity. And I think that it's been very effective in developing what has been is now the global strategic framework for food and nutrition. And they forced in, civil society forced in human rights-based approach with accountability in the 2013 framework. I think it's a very important accomplishment. It's something that is very highly contested. It is not, there is not sort of level stability, but it is a good example where there has been fabulous civil society cooperations at a social movement level.
Thank you. We have less than 10 minutes left, so we have 3 more questions. If you can make it really quick, like less than a minute, so that we get reflections from the 3 panelists. So.
Well, thank you very much to the panelists. I'm Anya O'Connor, representative of the Sisters of Mercy and a member of the Mining Watch Group here at the UN.
and we have been following the open working group process pretty closely. We have developed what we call a rights-based litmus test to look at the goals or even targets as they're emerging as a way that civil society, based on human rights-based principles. So I can give further information on that to people, but my question for the panelists is, how do we use this moment and not wait until the goals are developed to track the root causes? So like with climate change, they have the trackers of the negotiations. Could there be some momentum for civil society that we keep going after? Is this addressing root causes? But I'm really wondering, how can we galvanize the power of both social movements and civil societies to keep that accountability, not at the end, but now on root causes throughout the goals process? And any comments you have on that? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. 2 more. 1 minute.
Laura Johnston, Southeast Indigenous Peoples Center, and I appreciate your analysis of the situation. And it's really important that we have NGOs and CSOs that are accountable to the rights holders more than to the donors, because the corporations are directly influencing the missions. It's clear in what's coming out. So we know y'all need money. Plane tickets cost money, but we really have to question when we're proposing language, whether that's coming from the rights holders or from the donors to the NGO. And having said that, we're really concerned about development-related violence, and we think if we could raise more awareness about that, the delegations would put more language about human rights in there to safeguard from development-related violence coming right out of the SDGs like it did come out of the MDGs. So we're looking for an NGO who can get a corporation to give them money so we can have some slick flyers to persuade the delegates to put in language in there.
Thank you. Last.
Hi, I'm Linda Christensen Ruffman. Thank you so much for your presentations. I was reflecting back on the conferences in the 90s. One of the things that we did there was lobby government. But I think the most important thing we did there was to think ourselves through feminist eyes on the world. And I'd like to, and this was so refreshing for my eyes in my years to hear your panel. I haven't heard a lot of that discussion here or at the Social Development Conference or its commission. And I would love to, is there some place we can continue the discussion during the next 2 weeks?
Great. Thank you so much for all the comments and questions. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to think about these questions. It seems like a lot are based around really participation, but more about power and sort of thinking in a feminist perspective, organizing that power and participation, and just think about like sort of how some of the questions and how you want to respond as your last reflecting thoughts.
I forget now who said what we was about. I think one thing that's coming up in all the questions and comments is really the need to focus on movement building. And I mean, that's what we need, right? I mean, there's one thing of going inside the UN and trying to lobby a government and stuff, but there's movement building. And I was thinking, actually, I suddenly went to a flashback, Anita, 1999, and Anita and I were in Seattle at the WTO meeting, and we were walking to a women's caucus where we were supposed to go and add language on the document, and we just said, we're not going, and we ended up going and joining the protest and actually got tear gas, but I remember that moment so clearly, as this huge thing where we're just like, okay, look, there's 100,000 people out on the street. We're not going in there. And there was such an excitement when we came back, and then there were these huge protests in Washington, D.C. on the IMF and the World Bank. I mean, real structural issues being taken to heart. And we can't forget 9/11 and what that's done in terms of the kind of security state globally that we're living in, and how it has reduced the space for us to be able to do that kind of movement building and organizing that we were able to do. We had Occupy Wall Street in New York for a minute, and they put up all in jail, you know? I mean, they're still there, they're doing great work, but not in that kind of momentum building that we've had. So I think the resounding agreement amongst everyone is really a need to go back to movement building. And I think in terms of women's groups, I think that the 1990s, people talked about the 1990s, there was a lot of investment in movement building of the women's movement by donors. And that has completely dried up as well. And so, you know, the places to actually sit and strategize. I think, Carol, you know, everyone talks about where are we going to get together and strategize. We used to have those spaces to sit and strategize and come to, you know, agreement on, and sometimes very difficult conversations and agreements. But that space has also been reduced. So I think, and it goes, Isabel, to this thing of competition. I mean, it's because it's all shrunk. And so everyone's kind of scrambling. So I think we need to ask for an expansion of space. I also think that we should, you know, not rely on money and do movement building because of the sake of the movement. And I think we need it now. And I think as we're all here, let's figure out a way to just keep the momentum up and try and build a moment and a movement that can question the structural issues.
I agree absolutely with that. I think a lot of really good ideas have come out, but that movement building is one. Except we've got to go back to basics. And I said at the beginning that so many of the problems we're facing are exactly the same problems that have existed. It's just contextually changing. So is the need for activism. So is the need for social movement building. And if we don't do that, then we're not going to be able to influence this new big agenda that is being created. We've identified in the course of this, just in this discussion, some of the importance. And I think that having listened to how the actual structures work, if you look at the neoliberal agenda and how that has influenced development, how that has impacted on allocations of budgets so that then has to be a defense budget to protect the neoliberalism, etc., then we see that we are actually, you know, we have missed out on so many of the things that should have been done right, and we've got to claw that space back. For me, having spent a lot of time in post-conflict work and analysing the causes of those conflicts so that you can effectively address them afterwards, a lot of it has been based on the violations of social and economic rights or lack of access to social and economic rights, often caused by other countries and other countries' reactions to what is happening in those countries, which goes back to this idea of there needs to be a multilateral system that will actually control that. And we have to engage with that multilateral system to try and get preventative human rights approaches so that we actually are engaged in the stage before. This goes back again to what I was saying about this, the need for inclusivity of the participatory approach. And that's why I think it's not at all surprising when the NISA is getting the research back. Everyone is saying all the things that we're saying here. So there is already the potential of this social movement, and it comes back to what everybody wants. Everybody wants to have basic healthcare and education and have a place to live and make sure their kids are healthy and fed and happy. That's just universal. And if that's the universal truth, then the reflective version of that is to make sure that the human rights mechanisms which are there to guarantee those are useful and effective. And that's when we go back to the social movement, the activism, reclaiming that space, and doing what was said by one of the speakers, which is shining the light on those who are the biggest violators. Not accepting the fact that it's okay for Bill Gates to influence global policy because he's got billions of dollars going to outspend WHO. That's just not acceptable. And it's the same, you know, and on we go. But those are the things that we need to address because it does lead to a whole issue, which we haven't had time to go into, of the corruption, the war economies, the parts which are on a little bit in the grey areas, which you know is used to fund political campaigns of legitimate governments and so on and so forth. That's a huge, huge area of danger, I think, both for conflict prevention, but importantly for the control of use of resources. The one thing that I think is absolutely vital to remember is you can't, power isn't, you don't have power unless you use it. You have to demonstrate it. And that's what happens in militaries, that's what happens in economic terms, because they use that power. We have that too. And that's all we have to do. So we have to use the power that we've got to try to influence the power and direct the power, redistribute, and make sure that there is much greater equality than we're ever looking at if we go on this.
Well, I have to think with my UN hat because I think there needs to be a lot of movement building among civil society to really not be co-opted by the Post-2015 framework, but to really find ways of challenging it and also being proactive about what we want from this. But from the UN's perspective, I think, as I said from my opening comments, civil society is their comparative advantage. And it's the only multilateral space that actually is open to the UN. The problem is, as Radhika mentioned, we don't have the kinds of resources for that level of participation that we had at the time when, of the 90s, all the way leading up to Seattle, which was a momentum that built up to that. So without the resources, we're going to have to think creatively of how to channel perspectives in, and also how to expose what's going on inside out to those who are not here. So there's limited ways in which the UN does that. And so again, that's something that you can demand of the UN to do more in the regions, to do more, more public information out of the UN processes. And there needs to be much more sort of, engagement out rather than, when they talk outreach, I think it's more sort of, they need to create space for the in-reach, and so we have to demand that. Civil society needs to demand that, and as what NGLS can do in that is to be an ally, really, because we don't have a corporate branding of any particular delegation. Our brand is civil society, so we are to channel the voices. So that's the role. It is to, at least that's how I'm interpreting the role, but it is to be the liaison, to really reflect what the voices, what the narratives are coming forth. So how do you want that reflected? I'm putting this back to you all. What are the ways in which you want to hold the UN accountable? What are the ways in which, what are the spaces that you want to see more open? What kinds of information do you need? These are the kinds of things, it would be helpful to know more. We have a small team, but we can also leverage other parts of the system to be much more responsive. And I think they do need to be much more responsive and less extractive of your views and more responsive. Because right now there is a lot of extraction of views, but it's not necessarily, it's not a circular process. It's not a feedback process. Feels increasingly to me as a one-way process. So we're trying to construct something that is a fluid feedback loop, that has a proper feedback loop. But I think you can demand this from elsewhere in the system. It's not just from NGLS, it's from other parts of the system. So continue to do that. And what I've always loved about CSW is just the sheer numbers and diversity. It's so remarkable. It's so remarkable. And it's really always felt to me like untapped political power, not always. There were certain moments that it was really very powerful, but it feels less powerful to me now than it did earlier, even despite the numbers. So I'm not sure exactly, for those of you who are in pivotal places trying to organize toward Post-2015, think about how to leverage that here and now. It's a 2-week process, and I know there's a 1,000,001 side events, but maybe there needs to be a larger convening in a public space or something that really can galvanize and to spark, because it's hard when we don't all share the same information about the process. So we're not exactly sure where to plug in, So I just feel like for those of you who are plugged in, maybe even 10 of you get together and say, okay, this is how we're going to, these are the spaces in which we're doing it. It's not a side event. It's something much bigger. So maybe it's like, I don't know, 10 of the leaders of some of the bigger side events come together and say, okay, what learnings did we come out of these 10? And then where can we take it? That's just a suggestion. This is from my non-NGLS hat. But as far as NGLS goes, please let us know how you feel the system can be more responsive.
But can we actually do that? Could we actually identify which of the NGOs would be plugged in and would take responsibility for actually working with you to make sure that we get that done? And could we actually say, and we could stick it on our website, could we do that?
Sure.
So we're in, we'll do it. So we want 9 others at least to stand up and say they'll do it, and then what we've got is the beginning of a mechanism for the exchange of information that you can give feedback to, and then we make it bigger.
Okay, just
we have to really wrap
yeah, we
up.
do. I just wanted to tell you that there is already a mechanism, which is the Post-2015 Women's Coalition, that is a network of organizations from around the world, many of them here. And there is a listserv, and you are members as well. And so we could use that to do that. And what
There is a meeting of the Post-2015 Women's Coalition, for those who are not aware, on Thursday afternoon at 4:30 at the Baha'i Center.
Okay, meeting of the, I'm just going to repeat, meeting of the Post-2015 Coalition Thursday afternoon at the Baha'i Center. And I would be remiss if I did not announce that on Wednesday night at Club 21, we're going to dance and celebrate women. So please, all of you come Thursday at 8:30 at Club. And there's flyers up here, so we don't just negotiate, but we also have fun.
That's
So